So hello, everybody. Hello to all those of us joining online. I'm Ngaire Woods, and I'm Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government, and it's a very special pleasure to welcome you here today for this wonderful event to launch the Lemann Foundation Programme here at the Blavatnik School of Government. I want to say a special word of welcome to all members of the Lemann Foundation community in Brazil, in Oxford, and around the world who are joining us or who will join and watch this later on. It's a joy to have you with us and to welcome you into this community. The people you're joining here in Oxford, both online and in the room with me, are part of Oxford's large and growing community of people who love Brazil, who support Brazil, who study Brazil, or who identify with Brazil. So you're joining a large community here. So let me just say the Lemann Foundation, as you all know, and we'll hear more from Denis, its CEO, in a little while, but it's a foundation that strives to make Brazil a more just and equitable country by supporting education and also the development of leaders across Brazil, leaders committed to the social transformation of Brazil. And that makes the foundation a really perfect partner for the Blavatnik School of Government. We share that ambition and we take it globally. And today there's some 900 of our alumni working in every continent of the world towards that same mission. And today's event is the launch of a very special program to begin to share that expertise. We're very proud, it should be said, to be a 21st century school in a very, very old, indeed one of the oldest universities. And as we always say in Oxford, on our preferred ranking, the #1 university in the world. There's enough social scientists in the room to make sense of that. But mainly what I'd like to do today is to introduce Dr. Anna Petherick, the founding director of the Lemann Foundation Programme here at the school. Anna's a very special academic. She began her professional life as a scientist at Cambridge University, where she completed with great distinction her degree in zoology and genetics. And she then became a science correspondent at The Economist. I'm reliably told by others at The Economist, not entirely with joy, that she outpublished every one of them, that she had more stories annually than every other correspondent and more section leads. And it's a very competitive place, The Economist. So this is sort of said with admiration, but through gritted teeth. Anna then became editor and features writer at Nature, the world's leading multidisciplinary science journal, and subsequently social science columnist at Nature Climate Change, the monthly peer-reviewed scientific journal. As a scientist, she's an outstanding writer. And as a journalist, she proved early on that she's somebody that gets things done. Anna then came and did a doctorate here at Oxford, focused on Brazil and specifically on women's electoral participation and performance. In a system described by some, and indeed by her doctorate, in which parties are diverse, personalism prevails, and corruption is commonplace. Sadly, that describes about 190 countries in the world, but in Anna's doctorate, it specifically looks at Brazil. Anna brings a deep understanding of science and what it takes to test the rigor of any scientific findings, together with a fantastic doctorate in social science and political science. And it won't surprise you to know that since joining the School of Government, this, let me call you human dynamo, has not only co-founded the Oxford Government Response Tracker, truly a contribution to the world's understanding of how governments have responded to COVID. She's also won several prestigious research grants already, led in some of the MPP teaching, and won the university's Research Teaching Award. So it's with great delight for me, for us, for everyone in the Lemann Foundation community, that she's now going to turn her energy to founding and directing the Lemann Foundation Programme. So without further ado, let me turn to Anna Petherick, the founding director.
Thank you, Ngaire. Thank you very much. I too am thrilled to welcome you all here today. I'm thrilled to welcome those online who I'm recognizing some faces. I know you are spread all over Brazil, all over the UK, and in some other countries. I'm thrilled to welcome everyone in person, and thank you for the last minute COVID proof. Much appreciated. I am incredibly excited to be directing this new program. I'm incredibly proud of the team, and I'm going to ask them all to stand now. So Leah, Bia, JP, and Pedro, who's here for this term, do you understand as well? Just say hi. The world's most overqualified Zoom technician. So these guys are a fun, intelligent, committed bunch, and they are here to answer all of your questions today. So as Ngaire explained, this new program is the outcome of thoughtful discussions that have taken place over years between the school and the Lemann Foundation. As both institutions have developed and increasingly grown to recognize that they have a shared goal of working to improve the public sector. That process has been one of building trust and steady reflection. And as director, having that gradual discursive shared path up to this point provides a tremendous foundation upon which to build an independent vision for the program over the next 5 years. So I am personally excited to have the goal of creating knowledge to improve the public sector and working hard to make that really count on the ground. Before telling you a bit more about our vision for the program, I thought I would briefly jump back in time and tell you a little story. So those of you joining online might not get to see this beautiful school right now, but it is the youngest department in Oxford and certainly the most stylish. When it was founded in 2010, the global space for discussions about Brazil, learning from Brazil, was really wide open, optimistic, perhaps even viewed through rose-tinted glasses. Now, as Ngaire mentioned, I haven't always been an academic. I was a journalist. My mum would describe my background as very indecisive. I can see her on the call. But back in 2010, when I mentioned, particularly to Brazilians, where I worked as a journalist at The Economist, and very often today, indeed, I would frequently be asked about a certain cover of The Economist with the words Brazil taking off emblazoned across it. This is the one with the statue of Jesus Christ taking off like a rocket over Rio. And the message that was conveying was that Brazil's trajectory is really set to all intents and purposes on a course of economic growth, reducing inequality. That was the international mood at the time, and it was encapsulated and probably encouraged by that cover. Now, the week before that came out, I was flying through Sao Paulo. At the time, I was working as the Argentina correspondent of The Economist. And I took a decision to make a mad dash between connecting flights to have dinner with my colleague in Sao Paulo. And we talked about the upcoming cover. And we talked through his arguments. I thought it was risky, but he was a very clever guy. And he certainly understood that Brazil's rapid growth had been driven by high commodity prices, and there had been limited change to the structure of the economy to protect Brazil if commodity prices fell in the future. We talked through international metrics that suggested that many improvements would be good for the public sector, particularly in the area of education. Now, what people who ask me about that cover always forget or miss, and this was not my doing, is that if you actually opened that issue of The Economist, you would see an article about Brazil with the headline, the damning headline, "The Self-Harming State." Overstated as a headline, sure, but that's what headlines are about. But certainly also able to selectively draw on a few kernels of truth. Now, I've conducted research under Tim's guidance, I'll introduce you to Tim in a minute, focused on Brazil since 2013. And as pretty much everyone here is very familiar with, every single year that has passed since then has seen unforeseen, profound challenges for the country. Large protests, a huge corruption scandal, economic struggles, increasing political polarization, and most recently, ravages of COVID-19. So in short, as the years have passed, well, I've, if you like, had a shared sense of being part of Brazil's journey. It's felt as though the country's trajectory has turned ever more away from that image of Jesus Christ taking off like a rocket. And the space for discussions about Brazil, the global space, has been shrinking. But this view from afar conceals a praiseworthy sense of vocation and commitment from many people I meet who work in the public sector in Brazil. As evidenced by the late night WhatsApps from some people at the CGU as they draft a integrity system law, and I'm looking to a few people online. It conceals institutional islands of excellence, and it conceals geographical pockets of high achievements. For example, the educational attainments of Sobral being a case in point. So this sense of being part of the journey is why I'm personally delighted to be directing the new programme in the most global and public-spirited of institutions. The Lemann Foundation Programme here really inserts the Brazilian experience prominently into our internal discussions, and to those that we convene, as Ngaire so brilliantly and other members of staff bring together practitioners, ministers, heads of government to the school. And it's been through conversations with partners across Brazil that we have decided to focus on 3 core issues facing the public sector. These are all prominent in the story of sequential challenges of recent years that I just sketched out. And they all require addressing if the trajectory is to be changed in a sustained manner. So our knowledge building and engagement agenda is going to focus on building back from COVID. Because, for example, the evidence suggests that 4 months of a sudden study-at-home policy can lead to, on average, 2 years of lost learning by the time that young people graduate high school. We're going to focus on building integrity alongside an anti-corruption agenda, because the absence of corruption is not enough to foster trust in institutions. We need them to deliver on commitments as well to be worthy of that. And we need public institutions to be trusted for them to work properly. We're also going to focus on countering the ways that polarization can create impediments to the ability of the public sector to deliver for citizens. Now, all of these 3 themes are priorities not only for the Brazilian public sector, they're also crucial issues in many countries around the world. Now, I also want to emphasize that the Lemann Foundation Programme really takes seriously our aim to work with partners to create a tangible difference on the ground. And we especially want to work with partners in parts of Brazil that would particularly benefit from a collaboration with Oxford. And in fact, all three COVID research groups based in Oxford, who are featuring on the first panel today, have one foot in Oxford, another one in Brazil, and a toe in the north of Brazil. All too often, engagement done by top universities is in and out. This programme, I am determined, will not only take time to listen to those in the public sector to make sure that we really understand things from their perspective. We will also work with our partners over time as they go about the often very challenging process of implementing innovations. We basically want to be a buddy as they navigate the bumps in the road and learn from that. And in fact, our second panel today reflects our view that to build a research agenda that serves the public sector, you first need to listen to the experiences of those inside it. So, in other words, this programme is intent on being a sensitive, helpful partner to a self-improving state rather than a self-harming state. So, if you're in Brazil, I hope you have a wonderful morning. Here in the UK, have a fantastic afternoon. And I hope that today inspires you to follow our progress or hopefully join it over the next 5 years. And I'm going to hand over to Denis Mizne, the CEO of Lemann, to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Myron. Thank you all who came and who are participating online. I'm supposed to take this. It's a very rare moment. I was going to make a joke and I didn't make it. So you should, those who, So it's truly a pleasure to be here. We've been building this moment for quite a while now. And I want to recognize the work of our team at the Lemann Foundation, who unfortunately are not with us here today, but they are here. Anna Laura Schmidt, who directs all our collaborations with universities, and Julia Calegari, who has been working very closely with Anna and her team here to make this possible. I'm always incredibly impressed by the Blavatnik School. Since the beginning, since the first time we got to meet Ngaire when she came to Brazil. And we always saw here this amazing commitment to purpose and to concrete change on the ground. It's the combination between taking research very seriously, taking training people very seriously, but always looking at the impact that both those issues might have on policy. And you see this from top down. I'm having the privilege to be a visiting fellow of practice at the school this year. And by being closer to the school, you can see the incredible, powerful and inspiring leadership of the women, because basically this is a place run by women. And I think it's a privilege for us at the Lemann Foundation and for Brazil to be able to count on your strength and vision and capabilities to help us tackle some of our most pressing problems. I like a saying that says that every complex problem has an easy, cheap, simple, obvious, and wrong solution. And sometimes it seems, especially in the past year and a half, that the role of government and public commentators of social problems is to fail once and then keep trying to find the next solution that fits this description. And we are convinced at the Lemann Foundation that the only way that the problem becomes so persistent in a country, in a society, is because it is complex, it is hard, and you need to put the best capacity, the best capabilities, the best brains, and by best I mean diverse, people with different perspectives, different worldviews, different positions in the power structure, working together and discussing and thinking and learning about best practices and thinking about innovative ways to tackle and understanding the problem on the ground, and then being able to build solutions, implement them, and go through the process of constant learning, improving what's going on. There's no magic bullet. There's no silver bullet. There's no magic decision that will come from afar that we can just copy and paste. There's no shortcut. And if you want to build these solutions, and we desperately need them in a country like Brazil with persistent levels of inequality, with a series of structural problems that hinder our development, that have stopped our growth, that we all were so proud of seeing in the cover of The Economist. Of course, 4 years later, we saw the other cover of The Economist with Christ deciding to come back to the country. And I think we have an enormous opportunity if we can put together great research, train great people like the MPP students who are here and many others who came before them. It's an impressive group this year that I'm having the privilege to meet, like visiting fellows who you have a chance to hear from them, and build this to the broader Lemann Foundation community with other Lemann centers that we have established over the years at Harvard, at MIT, at Columbia, at Stanford University. We are developing our newest Lemann Center in Brazil now, the Lemann Center of Sobral that Anna mentioned, to have this experience solid from the ground also. And the idea of Lemann Centers is a combination, and Lemann programs like the one we're establishing here, is to combine not only the power of research and people to applied problems, but to be in the short term, building more research, putting Brazil on the map of centers of excellence, connecting excellent Brazilians on the ground to excellent people looking at Brazil from all over the world. But it's also in the long term, helping the country to develop more capabilities inside, and to be able to be a more important and relevant global player, especially in the areas that are so critical for Brazil's development. So that's the, small ambition that we have for this program. It would seem a lot, if not for, the leadership of Anna and the leadership of Ngaire and the incredible team they have already put together. So we're very excited about this. It's a pleasure to deepen our partnership with the school, and we hope this will be a long-term sustaining collaboration that will deliver concrete results on the ground for Brazilians. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Denis. Now, it is with huge pleasure that I get to introduce Professor Timothy Power, who is world-renowned expert on Brazil and head of social sciences here in Oxford. He's also one of the nicest guys who's really important that you will ever meet. So, Tim, thank you so much for delivering our keynote. Over to you.
So this will be a bit conversational, but thank you very much for the invitation. Everybody here at Blavatnik, Myron, Anna, and the team, thank you so much. It's great to have another space in Oxford to continue conversations about Brazil. We have some elements in the university that are doing things, the Brazilian Studies program at the Latin American Center. The Modern Languages has an excellent program about Brazilian literature and culture in the Humanities Division. The Environmental Change Institute, which is part of our School of Geography, also works on the Amazonian Basin. And we just recently had, unfortunately, the retirement of our Montague Burton Professor of International Relations, Andy Hurrell, who was one of the founders of sort of theory building in international relations in Brazil, and a specialist on the country's foreign policy. So, but the Lemann Foundation Program is going to bring a valued perspective on the public sector that we currently don't have, and it's sorely needed in this university. And we're really glad that the Blavatnik is leading on that. So I just want to say to everybody in Brazil, bom dia a todos e a todas. For you guys, boa tarde a todos e a todas. And just to offer a few remarks about Brazilian democracy and how it sort of situates the context that the program will be working in and the kind of issues that you'll discuss. So earlier this year, Brazil celebrated 36 years of uninterrupted democracy, which is exactly twice the length of the previous experiment with democracy in Brazil, which is after World War II from 1946 to 1964. So in chronological age, it looks good. But can we conclude from that Brazilian democracy is consolidated? I think the short answer is if you base your analysis on the period since, let's say, 2015, or particularly the last 3 years, you'd probably say, hold on, hold your horses, not just yet. But I think a longer answer might provide a little bit more basis for optimism. I think Brazil has reached a kind of a position that my colleague Philippe Schmitter calls the excluded middle, countries that are between democratic transition and democratic consolidation. Perhaps a regime that's unlikely to slide back into dictatorship, fingers crossed, but also unlikely to offer like a textbook example of consolidated utopian democracy. So putting this a little bit differently, we could say that for most of the past 20, 30 years, there have been few doubts in Brazil about the survival of political democracy. There have been lots of doubts about the quality of political democracy. So where you sit on that question, whether you see the glass half full or the glass half empty, depends on what criteria you're using. If you look at sort of Brazilian democracy kind of muddling through, stumbling forward since 1985, it doesn't look perhaps very attractive. But if you look at the distance it's come on some dimensions, it actually looks a bit better. So I just want to talk about a few of those bits of news maybe that wouldn't be in the headlines. But turning first to challenges, I think one of the enduring problems of Brazilian democracy is institutional. And this is the most obvious one, is the kind of work that I do, is about permanent minority presidentialism. Basically, Brazil's party system is so pulverized that the president will never have a majority in Congress. So most of the energy of Brazilian politics is focused on presidential power and forming majorities to pass legislation. So Brazilian presidents have to behave like Western European prime ministers. They have to fashion multi-party cabinets, and they have to get multi-party voting blocks on the floor of the legislature. All the Brazilians in the audience know this very well, and they know what it's called. The political scientist Sergio Abranches called it presidentialismo de coalição, the coalitional presidentialism. It has a superficial resemblance to parliamentarism, let's say, but it shouldn't be taken that way, because if this coalition abandons the president does not fall, because presidents have fixed terms. So in other words, the cost of defection is low in this system, and that means the price that presidents have to pay is high. It's very different from, say, the situation in the United States, where the party of the president never has less than 45% of the seats in the House and never has more than 55% of the seats. There's always within striking distance. But in Brazil, recent presidents have averaged about 15% of the seats in Congress. And I mean, technically, Bolsonaro has 0 because he doesn't belong to a party. So he starts at a very low base, put it that way. So one of the reasons for the unpredictability of presidentialismo de coalizão is the weakness of Brazil's party system. Except for a handful of parties on the left, most of Brazilian parties are devoid of ideology and discipline. They tend to have weak organizations, very generic platforms, low levels of consistency and continuity. In a typical 4-year Congress, 1 out of every 3 members of Congress will change parties. The current president of Brazil has been a member of 7 parties in his career, and as I mentioned a minute ago, currently is without one. The former governor of São Paulo, which I think a lot of people here know, has been in the same party since 1988, which is actually an incredible achievement for a Brazilian system, but is currently talking to 3 parties about where he might be going next. So because party labels don't carry much meaningful information in Brazil, only a minority of Brazilian voters can actually recall for whom they voted in the last proportional elections. So when you have that low level of identifiability, you're going to have low levels of accountability. It stands to reason, right? Many analysts believe that the weakness of Brazilian parties is linked to open list proportional representation. I won't go into the complicated way that works, but if you're a Brazilian voter, you know a lot about it. Basically, the story here is that elections are largely an individual affair, right? Politicians campaigning for themselves, when they get elected, they tend to believe that their mandate belongs to themselves and not to their political party. This means that the personalization of elections is rampant, and this leads to some of the most expensive campaigns in the world for seats in the lower house, right? So a lot of people bemoan the fact that there's a lack of party discipline. in Brazil, but other people look at it in a different way, that if you had coalitional presidentialism and parties were disciplined, the situation would be even worse because then the president wouldn't be able to pick off or buy legislators to support his or her program, right? So, so some people actually believe that coalitional presidentialism, and I hasten to say this is not easy to say, it kind of requires undisciplined parties to work. And I think it's worth remembering from the perspective of the Lemann Foundation Programme's objectives that public policies made in the context of undisciplined and transitory parties won't be very sticky. They can be highly vulnerable to interruption or abandonment with alternation in power. And this is indisputably a challenge to the public sector in Brazil, is an inability to project forward through time what parties will do or stand for and defend, right? So two other challenges to Brazilian democracy are executive legislative relations and robust federalism. Presidents control most of the agenda setting power in Brazil. That's not to say Congress is powerless. It is powerful, but it's a reactive power more than a proactive power. And more than 75% of all legislation approved in Brazil since 1985 has been proposed by the executive. So it's not an agenda setter, but it is powerful in terms of viscosity. Presidents dominate the legislative agenda through decree power, through urgency and fast track mechanisms, through modifications to the congressional calendar and so forth. Presidents have a lot of authority over public spending. The rules changed recently, but for most of the democratic period, the Congress could only authorize the budget, and it was up to up to the president to disperse the funds in a discretionary way, controlling when, how, and to whom they would be dispersed. So the reactive place of Congress in Brazil makes legislative life unattractive to a lot of ambitious politicians. They would much prefer to be serving in the executive branch, and that they will tell you this quite easily, not publicly maybe, because they might want to be reelected to Congress, but privately, most of them would prefer to be mayors or governors or ministers or secretaries. And this is understandable because after 1988, with the Constitution, more than half of central revenues were devolved to states and municipalities, very different from the way it was under the military regime. And state executives and mayors have the power to hire and fire, which is the lifeblood of political careers in Brazil. Governors are huge veto players in Brazil. They control, or they influence at least, their state delegations to Congress, which means that presidents have to negotiate with them on a continual basis. So all I tried to say so far is that there's a lot of imbalances of power in Brazil, and the institutional design of Brazilian democracy favors a strongly clientelistic style of politics. Now, Ngaire would be the first to say all systems have patron-client relations, right? But in Brazil, the concentration of power in the executive branch creates a small number of patrons and a gigantic number of potential clients. So at a national level, the dynamics of coalitional presidentialism mean that presidents have to give out cabinet portfolios mainly in exchange for legislative support, not necessarily because they're delegating a particular policy or program to the minister, but they need the party behind the minister is what. So ministers don't necessarily align with policies in a very neat way. In this sort of exchange of favors, it's lubricated by jobs, by appointments, and by pork, sort of perhaps unnecessary public spending. The rules of the game are known to everybody. Nobody can claim to be naive about it. A good example would be the PT, which for 20 years in the wilderness, from roughly 1980 to 2002, really excoriated traditional politics. But when it came to office, found that it couldn't really govern unless it sort of reverted to some of those practices to which it had been very critical. And you could say the same about the incumbent president, who promised to abandon coalitional presidentialism, but has now basically using many of its same tools. So purchasing governability, when presidents purchase governability via clientelistic exchanges, this has obvious costs for the goals of the Lemann Foundation Program, the things that you value, such as administrative efficiency and state capacity. But there are very few ways around the problem, given the configuration of political institutions. That's why I'm talking about political institutions, not because I'm have a nerdy interest in it, which I certainly do, but because it actually affects the way policy is made. So these challenges to democracy, they're all real. But since 1985, there have been some advances, some undeniable successes that continue to inspire us. I mean, Brazil made real improvements in economic management and in poverty reduction between 1994 and 2014. So the sociologist Celso Rocha de Barros, who's a newspaper columnist in Brazil and is a DPhil student, was a former DPhil here at Oxford at St. Anthony's College in sociology. He calls those years os 20 gloriosos, with tongue in cheek, the 20 glorious years of Brazilian democracy. And I would rather call those years something like a long social democratic cycle in which the PSDB and the PT were much closer than they are now, and in which they engaged in a policy competition to improve the lives of ordinary Brazilians. They did this by emulating one another. They did it by layering good policies upon good policies and getting them in the right order. So they sequenced it historically very well. Economic stabilization under Cardoso came before social inclusion under Lula, and it could only be that particular order. It couldn't be the other way around. It wouldn't have worked. But Brazil made serious advances in that period. I remember going to Brazil for the first time. I was a graduate student in 1985 was the first time I went to Brazil. It was incredible. I was there 100 days after democracy was born. The Brazilian rock scene was at its peak. Between 1986 and 1993, Brazil went through 4 currencies, you know, and people don't even remember the names of them anymore, but they were valued at up to 10,000 units per US dollar. In 1994, when Cardoso introduced the real, Brazil had a stable currency, and compared to an 80% monthly rate of inflation in 1990, it's been basically under double digits for most of the period since. Between 1995 and 2014, how many finance ministers did Brazil have? 3. The lowest number of any major economy in the world. The United States had 7, France had 11, and Japan had 16 or 17, something like that. 3 finance ministers in a country where the average tenure of finance ministers under Itamar Franco was about 2 months, something like that. So it was a lot of stability. After 2003, poverty reduction was considerable. The minimum wage nearly tripled in real value, and the so-called new middle class grew exponentially. Yes, Brazil was riding a commodity boom during those years, as Anna's interview pointed out. But that shouldn't distract us from the fact that there was real creative policymaking at the same time. So these things had a kind of, a virtuous circle, especially in the areas of conditional cash transfers, which Kim works on, and also in education and in housing. So speaking of procedures, Brazilians, I think, are justifiably proud of the way in which they've consolidated the electoral side of democracy anyhow. So since the 1980s, the country has had one of the fastest expansions of the electorate in the world. Brazilians here probably remember when their grandparents were voting, like say in 1955, only 25% of the population was eligible to vote. By 1975, that was 41%. And today, with the abolition of all kinds of restrictions, it's about 70%, one of the highest rates of suffrage in the world. Because of, it's 150 million people now, the electorate. Next year, it should be 150. Because of compulsory voting, absolute turnout in Brazil's presidential elections is higher than it is in the US, where voluntary voting exists. And the expansion has been very ably led by the Electoral Management Board, which in Brazil is called the Tribunal Superior Eleitoral, TSE, and which is recognized for its professionalism and impartiality. So beginning in 1996, Brazil adopted an electronic voting system that is the envy of the world, except for one person in Brazil. It's capable of tallying over 100 million votes before midnight on election day. So if I worked for the TSE, I think this resonates with Gabriela's research. If I worked for the TSE, I would be mortified by the comments of the President of the Republic. This is something that Brazil should be justifiably proud of. The expansion of political participation in Brazil also coincided with the growing density of civil society. This is transforming politics, the economy, and the culture. So we're talking about social movements, NGOs, unions, churches, neighborhood associations, racial and gender advocacy groups. They're all remarkably vibrant in Brazil, even in the current moment. And these transformations from below, I think, are the biggest difference between Brazil's democracy today and Brazil's democracy after the Second World War. Civil society was anemic back then, but it is very, very powerful and vibrant now. And I think today you have a vibrant and dense network of organizations that are countervailing against state power and that provide social or societal accountability, which is different from electoral accountability, which is different from institutional accountability, but it comes from below. And you see that in public mobilizations that we saw in '92 around the impeachment of Collor, that we saw in the anti-corruption demonstrations in the last decade. And they've been associated and aided by what Anna called islands of excellence in the so-called web of accountability. So, you know, the Ministério Público, the CGU, the Polícia Federal, which is greatly expanded, the courts. So these also were not very important in the previous experiment with democracy. But after the '88 Constitution allowed them to sort of grow endogenously, they have become very, very powerful. And impressionistic evidence suggests that this is important. Societal tolerance of corruption has nosedived in Brazil. So, I mean, once this was captured in the revealing phrase that every Brazilian knows, rouba mais faz, he steals, but he gets things done, was a you know, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, toleration of corruption. And that attitude has pretty much vanished in recent years. And if that's a real cultural shift, and I think there's evidence that it's really happening, this is a kind of a contextual factor that needs to be interrogated by the Lemann Foundation Programme, because institutional reform and public sector reform has to align with changing societal values about accountability and transparency, which I think are positive despite some of the institutional outcomes. So just to conclude, there are many challenges ahead for the people and the organizations that make up the public sector in Brazil. Many of those challenges are the isms that I teach about in my political science class and that we asked Anna to read during her DPhil when she was here. Things like corporatism, clientelism, populism, and authoritarianism. And these last two, populism and authoritarianism, I think have made a troubling resurgence in the past few years. I would love to come back and give my views about those two things without spoiling the nice vibe of your launch events today. But just to conclude, I think all four isms, corporatism, clientelism, populism, authoritarianism, are persistent challenges. So understanding them and seeing how they relate to the public sector, researching them, I think is where the social science division at Oxford can help, you know, because we are a truly interdisciplinary community. We do interdisciplinarity well in our social science division. And that's why having the Lemann program embedded in BSG, which is embedded in the social science division, is a recipe, I think, for success, just as is having Anna Petherick leading your program. So thank you very much.